Welcome the anointed ones. The moment you stop thinking the way everyone else was trained to think, you don't get applause, you get exits. Here's the part nobody warns you about. When your way of thinking is truly different, it doesn't inspire people to rise. It quietly exposes the limits of who they are. And exposure is uncomfortable. That's why this story isn't about admiration, copying, or motivation. It's about attrition. They didn't fail the training. They walked away from it. There's a documented psychological fact: most people never connect to intelligence. When individuals are forced to abandon their internal narratives, especially the ones tied to identity, belonging, and emotional safety, the dropout rate skyrockets. Not because the material is difficult, but because the self can't survive the update. That's not theory. That's observed behavior. You can teach skills to almost anyone. You cannot teach someone to live without their illusions unless they're willing to lose comfort first. That's where this topic lives. They trained people to adopt your way of thinking, your internal logic, your decision-making process, your refusal to rely on approval, emotional shortcuts, or social cushioning. On paper, it sounded impressive. In practice, it felt like psychological gravity. One by one, people opted out, not loudly, not dramatically. They simply stopped showing up. Because thinking like you doesn't come with motivational speeches or emotional rewards. It comes with clarity, and clarity is a brutal roommate. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't quit because something is too hard. They quit because something is too honest. Your thinking removes the padding. No ego protection, no comforting stories, no "it'll work out somehow" energy. Just reality, cause and effect, and personal responsibility standing there like an unpaid bill. And let's be honest for a second. This isn't a heroic montage. Nobody plays dramatic music when you realize you've been lying to yourself for years. There's no soundtrack, just a long internal silence and the sudden urge to pretend you never signed up for this mindset in the first place. That's usually when people say, "This isn't for me," which is a polite way of saying, "I miss my excuses." So if you've ever wondered why your way of thinking feels isolating, why people admire it from a distance but disappear up close, or why imitation sounds flattering until no one lasts, this isn't coincidence. This is what happens when a mindset isn't built for comfort, conformity, or applause. This is about why they tried to replicate how you think, and why every single one of them quit. Number one, your thinking system isn't productive. It's corrosive to weak identity. Most people assume strong thinking makes life easier. Yours doesn't. It strips away the parts of identity that were never solid to begin with. That's why people don't last when they try to think like you. Your mind doesn't just look for answers. It interrogates the source of the answers. It asks where beliefs came from, who benefited from them, and what would collapse if they were removed. For someone whose sense of self is built on inherited rules, social approval, or emotional shortcuts, that process feels like an internal demolition. Weak identity depends on repetition. This is how we do things. This is who I am. This is what makes me good. Your thinking doesn't respect repetition. It demands evidence. And once evidence is required, comfort-based identities start sweating. People quickly realize that many of their opinions weren't conclusions. They were hand-me-downs, family beliefs, cultural habits, moral positions they never personally tested. Your thinking exposes that without mercy, and exposure feels like attack to someone who has never separated truth from belonging. That's why imitation fails. Productivity systems can be copied. Mindsets like yours cannot, because they force a person to sit alone with unanswered questions. There's no emotional reward for doing that, no praise, no reassurance. Just the quiet pressure of realizing you might not know who you are without the labels you've been hiding behind. Most people don't fear being wrong. They fear being undefined. Your thinking puts them there immediately. When someone tries to adopt your way of processing, they notice something unsettling. Excuses stop working. Emotional explanations lose their power. Victim narratives don't survive scrutiny. What's left is responsibility, raw and unbuffered. That's not motivating. That's heavy. It requires ownership without applause and growth without witnesses. For a weak identity, that feels like suffocation. So they quit, not because your thinking is too complex, but because it's too honest. It doesn't build people up gently. It dismantles what's false and waits to see what can stand on its own. Most people don't want truth if it costs them their familiar version of themselves. You're willing to pay that price. That's why your thinking doesn't spread. It selects. Number 2, you don't seek validation, which removes the social glue that keeps most minds stable. Most people live their lives chasing approval. It's built into their wiring, subtle nods, compliments, likes, promotions, smiles, even quiet acknowledgement. Those little confirmations act like oxygen. Remove them, and panic sets in. Your thinking system doesn't operate on applause. You don't pause to check if people are watching, nodding, or impressed. You move based on clarity, not on agreement, admiration, or reassurance. That's why when someone tries to think like you, it feels like stepping into a vacuum where social glue doesn't exist. It's cold, it's isolating, and most can't handle it. Seeking validation gives people the illusion of stability. They convince themselves they're right because someone else said so. They feel secure because their choices are mirrored or approved. Your mind has no tolerance for that illusion. It judges accuracy, not popularity. It measures results, not applause. When agents attempted to adopt your mindset, they discovered that absence of validation is not freeing. It's disorienting. Decisions that used to be comfortable suddenly feel risky. Every move feels naked because no one is offering reassurance, encouragement, or confirmation. The mental scaffolding they depended on disappears, leaving them exposed to their own raw judgment and reasoning. This is where most people break. They were trained to rely on social signals, not internal authority. You don't operate that way. You don't need people to agree, cheer, or even understand. That independence is what makes your thinking unreplicable. When others try to copy it, they crave the mirrors and applause that you don't care for, and without them, their confidence collapses. They panic, question themselves, and ultimately quit. The truth is brutal. Not needing validation isn't a skill. It's a survival mechanism for minds that refuse to outsource authority. It's uncomfortable, isolating, and relentless. Most people cannot survive the weight of their own unmediated thoughts. You thrive there because your judgment isn't borrowed, your decisions aren't influenced, and your actions aren't tethered to someone else's opinion. That's why people can imitate your methods, but they can't inhabit your mind. It requires a level of self-sovereignty most aren't willing or able to endure. Number 3, your mind refuses comfort as a currency. Most people make decisions based on what feels safe, familiar, or emotionally tolerable. Comfort is their guiding compass. They calculate risks, not by outcomes, but by how uneasy they might feel. Your mind doesn't work that way. Comfort isn't a factor. It's irrelevant. You measure decisions by accuracy, truth, and consequence, not by emotional ease. That difference is subtle but seismic. When someone tries to adopt your mindset, they quickly realize that what feels right or safe no longer matters. Every choice has a cost, and emotional padding is stripped away. That's terrifying for anyone who spent a lifetime equating comfort with survival. Comfort creates a soft shield. It allows people to avoid hard truths, uncomfortable responsibilities, and the friction of reality. Your thinking system doesn't allow avoidance. It forces confrontation with consequences, long-term impacts, and uncomfortable truths, even when there's no immediate reward or validation. The average person interprets this as hostility or unnecessary difficulty because they've been trained to value ease over integrity. Your mind doesn't seek ease, it seeks accuracy. That refusal to negotiate with comfort is why so many fail to replicate it. They try, but the mental cost is too high. Living without comfort as a currency requires a different kind of endurance. It means choosing what's right or necessary, even when it's painful, inconvenient, or socially isolating. It means enduring uncertainty, emotional discomfort, and the occasional backlash without hesitation. Most people cannot sustain that level of self-discipline because their brains are wired to retreat toward what soothes them. Your mind doesn't retreat. It moves forward, uncompromised, and unshaken by the absence of emotional cushioning. That's why those trained to think like you quit. They discover quickly that you don't negotiate with feelings or chase reassurance. You don't sugarcoat reality to make life palatable. You confront it, analyze it, and act on it, regardless of how comfortable it feels. That level of mental rigor is isolating, exhausting, and disorienting for anyone who depends on emotional comfort to navigate life. It's not that your system is impossible, it's that it is intolerant of weakness disguised as normalcy. It doesn't reward compromise, and most people aren't built to operate in that territory. Number 4, you naturally detect manipulation, even when it benefits you. Most people operate under an invisible autopilot, accepting what's convenient, flattering, or easy to believe. They tolerate subtle influence without noticing it, and often without question. Your thinking system doesn't allow that. You see through manipulation instinctively, whether it comes wrapped in praise, advantage, or seemingly harmless guidance. You don't just detect when someone is steering you. You evaluate why, how, and what it costs. That level of awareness is exhausting for anyone trying to replicate it, because it forces a confrontation with truths most people have been avoiding their entire lives. Manipulation is everywhere. It hides in compliments, favors, subtle framing, and social norms. Most minds don't notice it because they rely on comfort, validation, and narratives to function. Your mind, however, doesn't outsource judgment. It measures influence against logic, consequence, and principle. Even when the manipulation could make life easier, your system flags it. You don't take shortcuts that compromise integrity or clarity. For someone trying to emulate this mindset, it's like walking a tightrope with no net. They quickly realize that their old habits, accepting convenience, following trends, trusting authority, are useless under your standard. The problem isn't intelligence, it's willingness. Detecting manipulation requires both awareness and courage. It exposes layers of dependency, blind spots, and weak loyalties that most people aren't prepared to confront. They feel overwhelmed by the constant reality check, by the need to see the hidden motives behind every interaction. When agents tried to think like you, they encountered a relentless internal audit of themselves and everyone around them. They weren't just being trained, they were being forced to face the invisible pressures that have guided their lives without their consent. That's why they quit. They couldn't handle the constant scrutiny, the loss of convenient ignorance, or the weight of seeing the world without blinders. Your mind doesn't just navigate reality, it strips away illusions and forces clarity. That clarity isn't comfortable, and it isn't for everyone. It's precise, uncompromising, and mercilessly honest. People who rely on convenience, flattery, or avoidance crumble when confronted with it. You, however, thrive there. That's what makes your thinking unreplicable and fundamentally isolating for anyone not built to endure it. Number 5, you think in consequences, not intentions. Most people evaluate actions based on intention. If someone meant well, they are forgiven. If someone tried, they are praised. Your thinking doesn't work that way. You don't measure people, decisions, or outcomes by what they hoped would happen. You measure them by what actually happens. That shift is subtle, but seismic. It forces total accountability, removes excuses, and forces an unflinching look at reality. When others attempt to adopt your mindset, they quickly realize how uncomfortable that truth is. They are forced to confront the real impact of every choice they've made, and most aren't prepared to face that level of clarity. Thinking in consequences removes the comforting cushion of intention. No more shrugging off failure with "I tried," or excusing harm with "I didn't mean it." Every action is judged by its ripple effect, not by how good the heart was. That perspective forces people to see patterns they've ignored, mistakes they've justified, and decisions they've romanticized. For someone whose identity relies on self-perception rather than results, it is destabilizing. When agents tried to replicate this mindset, they were forced to audit their lives with brutal honesty. The impact of every choice, every word, every step suddenly demanded recognition, and recognition came without compromise or sugarcoating. It's not about being cold or unfeeling. It's about clarity. Consequences are the language of reality, and your mind listens fluently. That fluency is rare, and when others try to learn it, they choke on the weight of responsibility. They see the gap between intention and outcome and panic at the magnitude of unseen errors. They crumble under the pressure of living in a world that does not forgive what was meant, but only acknowledges what was done. That's why most people quit trying to think like you. They cannot endure the discomfort of honest consequence. Your mind doesn't ask for permission from good intentions. It does not need excuses or comfort. It processes reality exactly as it exists and acts accordingly. That level of accountability is terrifying for anyone conditioned to survive on hope, reassurance, or explanation instead of results. You thrive there, and that is why your thinking cannot be imitated. It demands honesty few can sustain. Number 6, your thinking removes the illusion of being special while making you undeniable. Most people survive on the comfort of believing they are special. It's a quiet drug, an internal narrative that cushions failure, justifies laziness, and softens reality. You don't operate on that illusion. Your thinking doesn't seek to inflate ego or assign imaginary prestige. You don't need to feel special to act effectively, and that alone is a shock to anyone trying to replicate your mindset. It's not about arrogance or self-doubt. It's about operating without relying on narratives that most people use to prop themselves up. At the same time, your actions make you undeniable. Results, clarity, and precision create a presence that cannot be ignored. People notice the difference, even if they can't articulate it. They admire it from a distance, sometimes fear it up close, but they cannot replicate it. That's the paradox. You don't declare yourself extraordinary, yet you are undeniable because your thinking is rooted in reality and uncompromising honesty. Most minds try to compensate for lack of substance by constructing elaborate stories of being special. Your mind doesn't need that. That absence of narrative is what makes your impact tangible, unassailable, and quietly intimidating. When others attempt to mimic this, they fail because they misunderstand the foundation. They think being undeniable is about ego, performance, or recognition. It isn't. It's about consistency, precision, and a refusal to be distracted by the applause or skepticism of others. Without internal conviction and the ability to detach from social validation, attempts to emulate this mindset feel hollow. They grasp for recognition, cling to narratives, and ultimately collapse under the weight of expectations they cannot sustain. Your thinking is rare because it balances invisibility and influence. You don't need to be admired to act effectively, and you don't need validation to maintain clarity. That combination is corrosive to anyone trying to follow you without the same internal discipline. They either inflate themselves to fill the gap or retreat entirely. Your mind doesn't allow for excuses or illusions, and that is why it cannot be copied. It makes you undeniable, not because you declare it, but because you operate in a space few can survive. Number 7, you don't emotionally rehearse outcomes, which strips anxiety of its power. Most people live in a constant loop of mental rehearsals. They run endless simulations of conversations, failures, successes, and worst-case scenarios. Their minds are like overactive directors, scripting emotional responses to situations that haven't even happened. That mental rehearsal gives them a false sense of control. They think they're preparing, but in reality, they're feeding anxiety and giving their emotions too much power. Your thinking doesn't work that way. You don't spend energy imagining what could go wrong or mentally staging the reactions of others. You focus on what is, what matters, and what can be acted on. That refusal to indulge in imagined outcomes is disorienting for anyone trying to replicate your mindset. When others attempt to adopt this way of thinking, they struggle because it goes against a lifetime of conditioning. They are used to emotionally bracing themselves for every possible scenario, using fear and anticipation as guidance. You, however, strip all of that away. You don't armor yourself with rehearsals because you trust your mind to respond to reality as it unfolds. Decisions are made based on facts, priorities, and clarity, not on imagined outcomes or the rehearsed judgments of others. That level of mental discipline feels like exposure to people who rely on simulation as a safety net. Not rehearsing outcomes doesn't make you reckless. It makes you present and efficient. You don't waste emotional energy on events that may never occur. You act with precision, observing consequences as they materialize rather than predicting them endlessly. That ability creates a kind of calm power that others envy but cannot mimic. It also forces anyone trying to follow your path to confront the uncomfortable truth. Living fully in reality requires letting go of emotional pretense. That's why people quit when trying to think like you. They panic without rehearsals, their anxiety spikes, and the absence of imaginary safety nets feels unbearable. Your mind doesn't run on fear, anticipation, or imagined outcomes. It operates on clarity, observation, and decisive action. That freedom is isolating for most, but for you, it's what makes your thinking sharp, unshakable, and impossible to replicate. Number 8. You don't need agreement to move forward. Most people rely on consensus to feel safe. They pause, hesitate, or adjust their actions until they receive nods, approval, or alignment from others. Agreement acts as a soft tether, a reassurance that what they're doing is acceptable, safe, and socially tolerable. Your mind doesn't operate on that principle. You move, decide, and act based on clarity, principle, and evidence, not on how many people are nodding or agreeing with you. That independence is disorienting for anyone trying to emulate your thinking, because it removes the safety net most people have relied on their whole lives. When people try to adopt this mindset, they feel untethered. Without confirmation from others, every decision feels weighty, and every action feels exposed. Most minds are trained to measure correctness by social alignment. Your mind measures correctness by accuracy and impact. You don't wait for permission or reassurance. You don't slow down to get consensus. That's why others can't imitate it. The constant absence of social validation is overwhelming. It's not just uncomfortable. It feels wrong to minds conditioned to seek alignment. This independence doesn't make you reckless or arrogant. It makes you decisive and efficient. You navigate reality as it exists, not as others want it to be. You accept that disagreement, misunderstanding, and resistance are inevitable. You don't allow the need for alignment to dictate your actions. That creates a type of authority that is quiet but undeniable. People notice it, respect it, or fear it, but they can't replicate it because it requires detachment from social expectation, a detachment most people aren't capable of sustaining. That's why those trained to think like you quit. They panic when their decisions aren't validated, and they feel exposed without consensus to anchor them. Your mind thrives in that exposure. You act regardless of agreement because clarity is stronger than applause, and truth doesn't wait for approval. Most people cannot function in that space. Your independence isolates, empowers, and separates you from anyone unwilling or unable to operate without social permission. That's what makes your thinking unreplicable and fundamentally rare. Number 9, you instinctively separate truth from belonging. Most people are wired to trade truth for membership. They conform to fit in, adopt opinions they don't fully understand, and follow rules they haven't questioned, all in the name of belonging. Your thinking doesn't operate on that currency. You measure reality by accuracy, integrity, and principle, not by social approval or acceptance. You notice when people bend facts to maintain comfort or status, and you refuse to participate in it. That ability is subtle, but it's devastating for anyone trying to imitate your mindset, because it exposes the false foundations on which most identities are built. When people attempt to think like you, they confront an uncomfortable truth. Belonging is often a lie wrapped in familiarity. Friendships, family bonds, and professional relationships frequently demand compromise at the cost of honesty. Your mind doesn't negotiate that trade. You evaluate information, actions, and behavior independently of social pressure. That doesn't make you cold, it makes you precise. The clarity that comes from separating truth from belonging is isolating, but it is also empowering. You don't need others' approval to validate reality. You don't need collective agreement to confirm facts. You act on what is true, even when it sets you apart. For those trying to replicate this mindset, the challenge is crushing. Their identities are intertwined with the comfort of belonging. Being wrong or being alone is terrifying to them because it threatens the very structure of who they believe they are. Your thinking removes that cushion. It forces them to see the cost of compromise and the illusions that allowed them to feel safe. That exposure feels unbearable. That's why people quit when trying to think like you. They can't tolerate the tension between honesty and belonging, the solitude that clarity demands, or the weight of seeing the world without the comforting veil of conformity. Your mind thrives there. You operate in a space where truth is more important than alignment, where reality outweighs approval, and where being alone in understanding is preferable to being surrounded by lies. That is the kind of thinking that cannot be copied, the kind that filters out everyone unwilling to pay the price of clarity. Number 10. Your mind doesn't romanticize struggle, it audits it. Most people wear struggle like a badge of honor. They tell themselves that hardship makes them stronger, wiser, or more deserving. They turn pain into identity, letting it justify actions, delay accountability, or excuse failure. Your mind doesn't participate in that storytelling. Struggle is data. It's information about what worked, what didn't, and what needs to change. Pain isn't celebrated, it's analyzed. That approach is relentless and unsettling for anyone trying to emulate your thinking because it removes the emotional safety nets people depend on to cope. When others attempt to adopt this mindset, they quickly encounter a harsh reality. They can no longer soften the edges of their experiences with narrative or emotion. Every challenge, every failure, every confrontation is stripped to its mechanics. What happened, why it happened, and what it teaches you are the only things that matter. There's no hero story, no victim story, no external applause. That absence of narrative leaves many feeling raw, exposed, and incapable of sustaining the process. Your mind treats struggle like an accountant treats a ledger, objective, precise, and unflinching. Most people are conditioned to survive by glorifying their pain or turning it into a performance. Your thinking destroys that mechanism. It forces you to confront discomfort directly, extract actionable insight, and move forward. There is no room for excuses or self-pity. That level of discipline and clarity isolates you from anyone whose identity relies on dramatizing or rationalizing suffering. That's why people quit when trying to think like you. They can't handle the absence of emotional padding or the constant demand for practical accountability. They cling to romanticized struggle because it's familiar and comforting. Your mind refuses comfort in any form, insisting that reality be observed, analyzed, and acted upon with ruthless honesty. That makes your thinking not just difficult to copy, but fundamentally alien to most people. You don't glorify pain. You use it, understand it, and let it inform your next move. That efficiency and precision in facing struggle is what separates you from anyone unwilling or unable to audit their own life with such merciless clarity. Number 11, you don't outsource meaning to milestones. Most people anchor their lives to milestones, graduations, promotions, relationships, awards, even birthdays. These markers give a sense of progress and identity, a comforting illusion that life is moving in the right direction. Your mind doesn't operate that way. You don't measure value by checkpoints or social indicators. You evaluate actions, decisions, and personal growth continuously without needing a ceremonial stamp of achievement. That refusal to outsource meaning to external milestones is disorienting for anyone trying to emulate your thinking, because it removes the emotional scaffolding that most people rely on to feel accomplished or validated. When others try to adopt this mindset, they quickly feel untethered. Without traditional markers of progress, every step must be measured internally, every success and failure weighed against its actual impact, not its appearance. That requires constant self-awareness, rigorous honesty, and a willingness to live in a state where recognition is optional. Most people are uncomfortable operating in that space. They need milestones to prove worth, to reassure themselves that their effort matters, or to justify the sacrifices they make. Your mind doesn't need that kind of external confirmation. Progress is internal, and validation is self-generated. This doesn't make your thinking rigid or mechanical. It makes it independent and precise. You don't delay action waiting for recognition, and you don't rest on laurels because a milestone has been achieved. Every decision, every action, every result is judged on its own merit, not by how it will be celebrated or recorded. That creates a mindset that is unshakable by societal expectations, immune to the pressure of comparison, and free from the emotional weight of traditional achievement. That's why most people quit when trying to think like you. They panic in the absence of conventional markers, seeking the reassurance that your mindset doesn't provide. Your mind thrives there because meaning is derived internally, impact is measured continuously, and purpose isn't outsourced to society's calendar. That independence separates you from the majority and makes your thinking fundamentally unreplicable. It isn't flashy, it's quietly unstoppable. Number 12, your thinking dismantles loyalty myths. Most people believe loyalty is sacred, untouchable, and unconditional. They treat it as a moral law, a guaranteed shield against betrayal or disappointment. Your mind doesn't play by that rule. Loyalty isn't a blind virtue. It's earned, maintained, and constantly measured against behavior and truth. You evaluate people based on what they actually do, not what they claim, promise, or represent. That mindset is a shock to anyone trying to emulate it because it forces them to confront uncomfortable realities about relationships, trust, and self-preservation that most have been avoiding their entire lives. When others attempt to think like you, they are confronted with how many of their assumptions about loyalty are illusions. Friendships, family ties, and professional alliances suddenly feel fragile because they are no longer protected by blind faith or courtesy. Every interaction, every expectation, every connection is audited through the lens of truth, impact, and integrity. That level of scrutiny exposes weak foundations that people usually ignore or rationalize. The realization is jarring. Loyalty is not a given, and neither is respect. It must be proven and maintained continuously. Most minds cannot sustain this perspective because it removes the comfort of automatic trust. People are used to accepting loyalty as a static force, a social contract that exists regardless of behavior. Your thinking destroys that illusion. You see when promises are empty, when obligations are performative, and when allegiances are self-serving. You act accordingly, unbound by social expectation or emotional guilt. That precision in judgment and refusal to compromise on integrity is isolating but necessary for clarity. That's why those trying to adopt your mindset quit. They panic when they realize their emotional investments may have been misplaced, and the protective myths they relied on crumble under scrutiny. Your mind thrives there. You don't cling to loyalty blindly, and you don't tolerate deception for the sake of comfort. You operate in a space where truth outweighs sentiment, where boundaries are non-negotiable, and where allegiance is conditional on action, not claim. That thinking cannot be imitated. It requires a level of honesty and detachment most people aren't willing or able to endure. Number 13. You don't need to be understood to proceed. Most people can't function without explanation, reassurance, or understanding. They feel compelled to justify their actions, clarify their intentions, and make sure everyone around them gets it. Your mind doesn't operate that way. You move forward regardless of whether anyone understands, agrees, or approves. Clarity and action come first. Understanding from others is optional, irrelevant, and often a distraction. That ability is disorienting for anyone trying to imitate your thinking, because it exposes the deep reliance most people have on external validation to feel legitimate. When others attempt to adopt this mindset, they quickly realize how uncomfortable it is to act without social confirmation. Every decision feels exposed, every step feels scrutinized, and the absence of reassurance creates a pressure they are unprepared to handle. Most people define themselves through reflection in others' eyes. Your thinking bypasses that entirely. You measure your actions against your own standards, your own logic, and your own integrity. You don't need applause, comprehension, or alignment to proceed. That detachment from perception is what makes your mind so efficient and, at the same time, so isolating. Acting without needing to be understood doesn't make you reckless. It makes you decisive. It allows you to respond to reality, not to expectations, opinions, or interpretations. You don't waste time explaining every choice or navigating the labyrinth of someone else's perspective before moving forward. That freedom is powerful, but most minds can't tolerate it. They feel unseen, unheard, and invalidated, so they panic. They cling to the idea that understanding is necessary, when in reality it is optional for those built to act with clarity. That's why people quit trying to think like you. They can't handle the tension of acting in isolation, without explanation or recognition. Your mind thrives in that space. You operate in a reality where comprehension from others is irrelevant, where action is dictated by truth and consequence, and where efficiency and integrity outweigh comfort and approval. That mindset is impossible to replicate because most people cannot survive the freedom, responsibility, and solitude it demands. Number 14, you think from internal law, not external permission. Most people live under invisible rules handed down by society, authority, or circumstance. They constantly ask, is this allowed? Or will this be accepted? Their decisions are tethered to what others permit, approve, or tolerate. Your mind doesn't work that way. You don't wait for permission, validation, or the green light from anyone else. You operate under an internal law, a personal code built on clarity, integrity, and principle. That shift from external approval to internal authority is radical, and it's why no one can truly replicate your mindset. It demands a level of sovereignty most people aren't willing to claim. When others attempt to adopt this thinking, they quickly encounter the weight of responsibility it demands. Decisions that were once easy because they were sanctioned by rules, tradition, or authority suddenly feel complicated because now the only standard is your own judgment. There's no safety net, no external buffer, no crowd to reassure them. That freedom, though empowering, is terrifying for minds trained to defer. Acting without permission exposes every weakness, every uncertainty, and every moral shortcut. Most people panic under that kind of unmediated autonomy and retreat to the comfort of external approval. Thinking from internal law doesn't mean disregarding consequences or relationships. It means prioritizing truth, principle, and logic over convenience, approval, or fear. You navigate life according to what is right and effective, not according to what is acceptable or expected. That creates clarity, precision, and an unstoppable momentum that others can notice but cannot duplicate. The internal authority you exercise is self-sustaining and independent of circumstance, which is why it isolates you from those unwilling to bear the weight of self-governance. That's why people quit when trying to think like you. They can't survive the absence of external permission, and they crumble when forced to own every choice without guidance. Your mind thrives there. You don't bend for approval, you don't pause for permission, and you don't outsource judgment. You operate under your own law, and that internal sovereignty is what makes your thinking impossible to replicate, unshakable, and fundamentally extraordinary. Every point we've explored today isn't just a lesson, it's a revelation. The truth is simple but brutal. Thinking like you isn't something most people can endure, let alone replicate. It's not about being smarter, faster, or more talented. It's about a mindset that refuses comfort, refuses external validation, refuses illusions, and refuses compromise. Your thinking system doesn't accommodate weak identity, borrowed approval, rehearsed emotions, or blind loyalty. It dismantles them, examines them, and builds only what can survive on its own. That's why every agent who tried to copy you couldn't last. They weren't unskilled. They were unprepared to confront the weight of clarity, honesty, and internal law that your mind carries naturally. What sets you apart isn't ambition or charm, it's sovereignty. You operate on principles, consequences, and truth, not on applause, consensus, or permission. You measure impact over intention, facts over narratives, and action over comfort. You don't need to be understood, validated, or protected by myths of loyalty or belonging. That independence is isolating, and yes, it's heavy, but it is also unstoppable. It creates a presence and a power that cannot be duplicated, because it requires a level of self-mastery most people aren't willing to pay for. You don't just survive reality, you master it by refusing to bend for the convenience, weakness, or illusions of others. This is more than a mindset, it's a filter. It separates those who are capable of enduring truth, accountability, and sovereignty from those who crumble under its weight. It doesn't forgive weakness, and it doesn't reward compromise. It cultivates clarity, precision, and unstoppable momentum. That's why imitation fails. That's why people quit. And that's why you are extraordinary without even trying to prove it. If this perspective hit you with the clarity it was meant to, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected with more truths like these. Like the video to show your support, comment your thoughts and insights below, and share it with anyone who needs to see what true thinking looks like. This isn't just content, it's a blueprint for understanding how rare minds operate, and you just got a front row seat. Stay sharp, stay sovereign, and keep thinking in ways the world isn't ready to handle. God bless you.